So, one of my big questions after reading it was, tell me a little bit about what kind of drove you to write it. Why'd you do it? Why'd you write the book?
Well, that changed during the writing of the book. So I got the idea to write about this not long after I had a huge panic attack when I was taking my daughter to college, and they started talking about the safety provisions on campuses. And I had been raped on a college campus in Cleveland, Case Western. I was working, I was not a student, and it was a stranger, not another student, but I had kind of buried that and tried to move on, and it really wasn't until I took my daughter to a college campus and realized that she was prey. I mean, that's the word that came to me, prey. And I thought, well, I have to deal with this. I've pushed it away for 21 years. I have to deal with it, and I'm a journalist, and the way I deal with it is by writing about it and looking into it. And I had decided that the man who raped me, I knew his name. He had been caught and convicted, but I had been sequestered during the trial, so I knew very little about him. And my family didn't tell me. We all wanted it to be in the past. My family didn't tell me much about him. And I realized as I was turning all of this over in my head that he was one of the most influential people in my life, and I knew nothing about him. He had dictated the way I lived after that, the way I was always anxiety-ridden about my kids and very cautious myself. I had lost a lot of my sense of adventure, a lot of my sense of joy. And so I decided that was the reason I started out, to deal with it for myself. And I didn't even see it being published. But then the editor of the Plain Dealer got wind that I was doing this and asked me to do it for the Plain Dealer. And I did it. It took a few months. I did it for the Plain Dealer. And when it came out, I heard from so many women who said, I never talked about it. I never told anyone. In my own newsroom, 3 women came up who were reporters and said, I never talked about it. I never told anyone. And I was approached to do a book because the piece in the Plain Dealer got national attention. And I thought about it, do I really want to expose myself even more? And then I thought, you know, we need to start not thinking of it as exposing ourselves, first of all. We need to start talking about this, all of these women. It was such a profound experience to me to read their emails and hear their voice messages that, you know, they felt so alone and they had never told anyone and they didn't know how to talk about it. And that was really the impetus for then doing it as a book.
So when you, I guess when you wrote about it,
Mm-hmm.
I kind of thought at first that it was always for a book, but it
Mm-hmm.
came later that your investigation ended up being for a book.
Well, no, I thought about it.
Okay.
I didn't plan to do it for the paper.
Okay.
And I thought, well, I'm going to do this, and maybe it'll be a book, and maybe not. It was a really, I thought I had no chance of getting it published as a book, but I wanted to do it, and so I thought I went at it in that way. And then, you know, it became a piece for the paper, which was a good thing, because I need a deadline, and I would probably still be working on it, you know, all these years later. So it was good that the editor wanted it for the paper.
So it came out 8 years, the book came out 8 years after you wrote the paper.
Yeah.
So what was the process in between, you know, the series for the paper and the book?
Well, some personal things took a few years. My mother was very sick, and I was the only one living nearby, and so I was still working, and my kids had gone to college, but I was still very involved, and so I really didn't have time. And then after her death, I managed to procrastinate for about a year, and then I finally thought, well, I'm going to do it, and did a proposal. And proposals for nonfiction books are very extensive. It ended up being 60 pages. And so that took some time. I found an agent right away, and then I was extremely lucky that it sold to Grove Atlantic, because I landed an editor, the editor of my dreams. Her name's Elizabeth Schmitz. And we worked so well together, and she cried the first time we talked about it, and she was so attuned to it, and so it all worked out. Maybe if I had gone right into doing it, I wouldn't have hooked up with her, so.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So the book came out in April, is that correct? Okay, so you said that you got a lot of response from the article in the Cleveland Plain Dealer, so tell me, was the response even more from the book, or what kind of response did you get?
I got, well, one problem is I don't have a website, and my publisher didn't put my email address in the book. But a lot of women did the sleuthing on the internet. I mean, it didn't take that much, and found my email address at the Plain Dealer. So I did hear from a lot of women. It is heartbreaking sometimes. I mean, sometimes they're just pouring everything out, and it's clear that they've not talked about it or dealt with it. And then it got reviewed, and so I heard from people after the reviews, a lot on Twitter, and some on Facebook. I gathered a lot of new Facebook friends who are strangers, but and heard through those channels rather than email. A couple of people even figured out my Plain Dealer phone number, which was surprising. So, but it was a big response, but it was not as, maybe because I expected a little bit. It was not as shattering in a way as the first ones were.
The first one's from the article.
Yeah.
Okay. So what, the women who wrote to you, and even the women who may have been affected and not spoken to you about it, what do you hope, they got from your book, and what do you hope spoke to them about it?
Well, I hope that they, through seeing, okay, one thing that I did as I was starting the series for the Plain Dealers, I went and took the volunteer training at our Open Arms. It's called the Cleveland Rape Crisis Center. Very extensive training, weeks. And I realized how I had felt so alone and so oddly ashamed, and there's no reason to feel ashamed, but I did. And odd, like this wasn't normal. And I learned at that training that it's entirely normal, that this is almost universal, the way women react with being ashamed, and there, as you saw in the book, there are lots of historical reasons for that being ashamed. Acculturation through the generations. And so I think that helps to just read it and say, okay, it's not only me. I'm not the only one who has these feelings. Other people feel this way. And here are some of the reasons that we do. And maybe it'll help them open up and start talking to people or go to therapy. I've also learned, as I wrote in the book, that when you're diagnosed with PTSD, one of the main treatments that they use for returning soldiers, and some soldiers it works for and some really don't like it, but it's so odd because I had written this story and this was sort of at the end of my research. The main therapy is telling your story over and over again. And that's what they do with the combat soldiers returning. Now, there are new things they're trying. They're even trying LSD, but that still is sort of and it sure worked for me. It works to remove that feeling of isolation, to normalize the feelings. Because what happens with PTSD is the trauma was so scary or jarring or life-threatening that you have those feelings, but you do not want to take them out and feel them again in any way. And so you let them fester, basically. And so the process of telling your story takes those feelings out. You look at them, you experience them again as you tell the story, and then it kind of normalizes it. Not that it's a normal experience, but it makes it so it isn't, you don't feel like you have to run away from it.
Okay, so you said first in your book that it was almost a cold retelling. Like it was, you were detached, kind of
Yes.
like when you disassociated during the actual rape.
Right.
So when you went back for the articles and the book, that's not a cold retelling. What was it like for you to kind of force yourself to relive it and do a retelling with your feelings?
It was hard, and I put it aside a lot, as my colleagues and then my husband can tell you, that I found an awful lot of housework that really needed to be done right away. So it was hard. I cried some. It was hard to write about other family members. I got all of their permission, but it was still hard because that is, everyone has their own story to tell around any story. And, you know, they all read it as I was writing it. And so it wasn't that I was afraid they'd be angry. It's just hard to kind of appropriate that as someone else's story. Although that, again, is journalism, isn't it?
You're not appropriating, you know, you're appropriating people's stories you don't know. This
Yeah.
was your daughter, your mother,
Right.
your husband's
Yeah.
story.
And that was really hard.
Okay. So I'm going to jump back real quick to when you were talking about your rapist and how he was one of the most influential people in your life. So tell me more about that, because when I think influential, I think in a positive way.
Right.
So
Yes.
tell me a little bit about how you came to that realization and what it was like to think of a negative event as influential.
Right. Yeah, I think of influential. I never came up with a better word of influence. He influenced my life more, as much as my closest family. And that's because before the rape, I was really fearless, and mostly in a good way, not entirely. I mean, I got to be a little reckless, but I was young. I had that feeling that nothing can happen to me or it won't happen to me. And after it, I became, well, my ex-husband said to a therapist, she's a different woman. And I really was. I became extremely fearful when I had my children. I just was on high anxiety the whole time. And I know there are helicopter parents, but I was, you know, in a Black Hawk helicopter circling my children. And I became less fun, if you understand that. And it's not like, oh, my friends say you're not fun, but just I lost a sense of that sort of spontaneity or joy in life, just able to have fun. I kind of became, I was so worried. And then I had bouts of depression too, that I would sometimes link to the rape and sometimes not. I would think it was, you know, because I was working too hard or worried about the kids or whatever. So in those ways, and so he influenced my actual life in ways that, for instance, I started working at home as much as I could. I was the film critic for part of that time, and and back then, I was often the only person who would go to the daytime screenings. And I actually asked the theater managers to lock the theater doors because I would be so distracted from watching the movie worrying that somebody was going to come in the door of the theater. Things like that. I wouldn't go places. I never walked outside at night by myself, and I was even worried when I was with other people. So it constricted my life, and he constricted my life.
So that's a big change. Yeah, I think it was in one of the articles I read, not in your book itself, that you said, like you just said, you were carefree, you were, you know, really brave, and rape seemed, I believe you said, like a rallying cry.
Yeah.
It was something that was political, not personal. You know, it would never happen to you. So I think that's something, I related to that. I think that's something a lot of people my age and other ages can relate to. So what would you say to Joanna Connors of 29? You know what I mean? What would you say to yourself and to others who have those feelings now?
I've had to talk to my daughter about it, and it's very hard because I want her to have that full life. I want her to be bold, but I want her to be cautious too. And in a way, she has to establish that line for herself. But I was so aware every time I talked to her about it of not wanting to shut her down. And luckily, I haven't. I mean, she is a very, very happy, and she's active and does all kinds of things, and she lives in a big city. But what would I say to the Joanna back then? I don't know. Stop hitchhiking. By then, I had stopped hitchhiking, actually. So I would say go back in time and never hitchhike. I can't believe I did that. Listen to your gut, I guess I would say. And you talk about women's issues. Rape is a woman's issue. But another woman's issue that ties in so much to this is that we are so, much more than men, acculturated to be polite and to not seem rude to other people. And, you know, men are much more able to be their strong self in the world, in a way. And maybe this is changing with your generation, but my generation, it was very much, you know, be polite. And so I overrode my caution, my gut, because I didn't want to seem rude to the guy. I didn't want him to think I was, you know, afraid of him. Yeah.
So that kind of reminded me of, I think it was another interview I listened to of yours about, you talked about self-talk, those are my words, but women, you're harsher on yourself than other people are. And I remember there was a point in your book where Levenberg, which was the attorney, he asked you, he asked your husband to go out of the room, and he asked you, why did you go in the theater with David? And in the next chapter you say you wanted to cuss him out, but you said it was a reasonable question, but you would never admit that.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about that thought process, and why was it reasonable, and do you still think that?
It was a reasonable question for me to ask myself, not for him to ask me, because when somebody else asks a survivor questions like that, maybe completely unintentionally, they make it sound like they're blaming you, like you were the reason this happened. Why did you go into that theater? That implies you set it off, you're the reason. But it's a reasonable question for me to ask myself. I guess that's what I meant in the book, to ponder that, and why did I do it? Why? And that's when I came to the conclusions of being, we're so trained to be deferential and polite, and I see that changing in my daughter, and in her generation. I really do see that changing. And I see the whole silence about rape changing, finally, with young women, which is so great to see. But you know, all these women recently who have said that they were groped, most of them are around my age, and they've all said, I always thought it was my fault. I never told anyone because it seemed stupid.
You went through that too.
Yeah.
Thinking it was your fault. Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, I did.
But
And that's why it was reasonable for me to ask that question, because I did think it was my fault. I asked myself, why did I ever do that? I had a little bit of caution about it, and yet I did it. And it was all tied up with race and not wanting to look like a racist and be that white woman who's afraid of young black men. It all came from the reasons were all good reasons, but they I don't know. I mean, it was the one time in my life that being polite, you know, led to bad things, but you know, they were good. It was good to not want to be rude. It was good to not want to
you're trained that way.
be a racist. Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting how, I guess, rape culture and just how women are socialized kind of wraps all together to kind of come into this.
Oh, it
woman's
does.
life.
It
Yeah.
does. You know, the woman, and you probably don't want to use this because it's political, but the woman who said she was on the airplane and Trump groped her on the airplane, she never confronted him. She just got up and went back to her seat. And that is that's the socialization that we have and that I'm talking about.
And like you know, going in with him even
Yeah.
against your gut.
Yeah. So I would tell Joanna, be bolder even than you are, but be bolder in defense of yourself and in what your gut tells you. And not as reckless in the other ways, like going out to walk alone at night in, you know, dicey places, which I also did.
Okay, I think we're running out of time, but I have two more quick questions
okay.
for you. Okay, so tell me, you know, I was really surprised pleasantly by the race aspect of the book. I didn't expect that going in. Did you, I guess, kind of expect to confront race?
I did. I really did, because I wanted to know who he was, but I sensed that all of this was tied up. Somebody at the book launch at the City Club of Cleveland, somebody said, I was raped by a black man, but I've never told anyone that he was black. I've just said I was raped. And I didn't answer that. Later, of course, I thought of what the real reason was, and the answer is I wouldn't have written the book if it was just about my rape. Those have been written. People have written books about rape, and yeah, it's personally cathartic, but it was not interesting to me. And what was interesting was to find out, you know, we're in these two Americas, and what were our lives like, and then we intersected.
There's your news judgment, right?
Yeah.
It's not interesting to me. Yeah. Okay, so so tell me, you know, it was something that was interesting, would help other people, but do you think that through writing it, you've also healed?
Getting there. I mean, you know, it's a process, and it's, as I said, telling the story again and again, and hoping that it reaches other people. But at the same time, I'm telling the story, and two things happen, actually, because I did disassociate so much along the lines from that story. Like, I was watching another woman. I was watching another woman being a journalist. I was watching another woman. So telling the story brings it back to me, first of all, which is an important thing, I think. It takes away that divided self. And it also, when other people come and talk to me about it, it kind of, you know, it's that we're all in this together thing. we all have to watch out for each other. We all have to listen to each other. We all have to listen to the stories other people have and need to tell, which is, again, something journalists do. I mean, a lot of times they don't want to tell their stories if they're politicians, but, you know, to feel like we're all one rather than all these separate people dealing with our own traumas alone and afraid.
That kind of relates back to your rallying cry, you know,
Yeah.
the sisterhood of,
Mhm.
of feminism.
Right.
You know, when you were that age.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, one more question.
That's okay.
Tell me, you spoke of two Americas
Mhm.
and kind of the differences between, there's a lot of differences between your rape and
Mhm.
most
Sure.
other ones.
Yeah.
You know, I mean,
Oh, yeah.
you reported right away,
Mhm.
which is uncommon. You know, had a rape kit exam and your offender went to jail. And
Right.
also, it was stranger.
Yeah.
And stuff like that. So
And
tell
a
me,
weapon.
yeah,
Yeah.
it was a lot of differences. So tell me, I guess, did that also push you to write the book, or?
It was not ambiguous, which helps, and that, I always say, actually made me lucky, even though he had a weapon and even though I was certain I was going to be killed. And that, you know, was such a turning point for me psychologically. I thought I was, you know, spending my last minutes or hours on earth. But I was still lucky because there was no ambiguity to me or to any of the authorities or to my family. And I mean, rape is a continuum, and every rape is different, but there's still a continuum, like there is with autism, there's a spectrum, or like there is with cancer, there's all kinds of varieties and ways that it's dealt with. And I think about the women who, say, are on a college campus and it's a popular guy that they really liked, and is in their group of friends, and how hard is that for them to report it and be shunned, which happens to most of them, or report it and be dismissed, which also happens to a lot of them, or to report it and be blamed by their family or by their friends or by the guy, and to, you know, how hard is that? It was easy for me to report my rape. I don't know, I don't think it made a difference in whether I would write it or not. It was just the story I had to tell, I guess. But I volunteered for our Rape Crisis Center for several summers when they had this a week-long summer camp for adolescent girls where they taught them, they used the arts, and every day a different art was used. They did dance, they did music, they did drawing and art, and they did writing, and I came in and helped with the writing one. And so these are all 12 and 13 and 14-year-old girls, and they come in the way girls that age do, just all, you know, tough, and I was even a little intimidated by them because they were, and then as the day went on, they wrote their pieces. We said, share them if you want, don't share them, and one girl would share, and then the floodgates would open. And the things that these 12 and 13-year-old girls had experienced, I cried on the way home every time. So there are a lot of stories that need to be told. And they all seem to, those days, find something helpful in writing their stories and then reading them to each other.
Like you did.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you so much, Joanna.
Thank you.